Welcome to the deep dive for this week. Don't forget to visit the website at deepdiveau.net. Check out our socials and Patreon page at the Deep Dive AU. Subscribe via your favourite podcast app or like and subscribe at our YouTube page at the Deep Dive AU. And don't forget, go to www.deepdiveau.net, go to our merchandise page where you can purchase one of these deep dive mugs.
This is the Deep Dive Podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Leesa Tuffnell received a Bachelor of Occupational Therapy through the University of Queensland in 2003 and is certified in training and assessment and mental health first aid. Leesa is an accredited NLP practitioner, somatic coach and yoga teacher. Leesa has been employed as a senior clinician, supervisor and operations manager. She has also worked in quality assurance, clinical excellence, product management, research, learning and development, and risk management. Leesa Tuffnell, welcome to the Deep Dive. So what is imposter syndrome and how can it affect new graduate therapists as they begin their careers?
Well, I think before we even jump into the interview, Michael, and at the risk of being your most unpopular guest, I was just going to start off with a little truth bomb about imposter syndrome when it comes to new grads. So I can say with pretty much 99.9% certainty that the vast majority of new grads haven't yet experienced imposter syndrome as part of their professional journey. So what they would have encountered, however, is a pretty severe case of self-doubt. So self-doubt and imposter syndrome, they have similarities, but they're also quite different. So when it comes to doubt is just a very natural human emotion. It is universally experienced. It is that feeling of uncertainty. It's that lack of conviction. Self-doubt is lack of faith in oneself. So really being unsure about your abilities and your decisions and your actions. And self-doubt sometimes causes us to, behave in different ways. So we might procrastinate or we might avoid certain things, or we could overwork. So there's sometimes a concern with doubt that we might make a mistake, or heaven forbid, we could even be rejected. So imposter syndrome, on the other hand, is a different type of doubt. It is a very persistent, it can often be a very pervasive and dysfunctional belief that you're maybe not as smart or as capable as others think you are. So imposter syndrome is all about doubting your accomplishments and being fearful of being caught out despite all evidence to the contrary. And that right there is the point of difference. So doubt is us just feeling unsure. Imposter syndrome is feeling unsure despite having all the skills and the qualifications and the experience. So for our beautiful new grads who are entering the workforce, they're really still developing their clinical acumen. So they're gaining experience, they're learning, and doubt is it's just a very normal and expected part of that process. And the good news is that doubt and imposter thoughts and feelings, all of those things can actually be very, very useful. So they definitely don't feel comfortable, but just like every other emotion, doubt serves a purpose. So it has a function. And I think new grads they get to harness the power of doubt and make it work for them rather than against them. So for instance, doubt is a really great indicator as to our level of personal resourcing. It just invites us to explore what tools we might have in our tool belt, what might we be missing? What tools do we get to add? I'm also just going to mention at this point that I don't believe the term imposter syndrome is a particularly helpful one for new grads or for anyone really, I think, for that matter. I do admit that I use the term just because it's recognised, but I honestly do with a really big degree of disdain, just because imposter syndrome, that word, it just makes you feel like a faker. Language is so important. Our cells hear every word that we speak and we think. So when we use a word like imposter, the brain immediately senses a lack of something. There's a shortfall. So it triggers that physiological stress response in an effort to keep it safe. Unfortunately, that response is a little bit misguided. And I think, secondly, the term just pathologizes something that doesn't need to be pathologized. Imposter syndrome is not a diagnosable condition. And calling it a syndrome just implies that the person who's experiencing it is sort of, they're defective, or they're unusual, or they're sick. And we don't need to be cured. We're simply experiencing that normal human emotion, which is doubt. And I think, finally, the term imposter syndrome, it doesn't offer us any credit at all. We know from our neuroanatomy that the way we learn, the way that we build scaffolding in our brains, is through experience. It's through making mistakes, and mistakes just provide us with feedback. And that feedback then provides a pathway to gaining a new skill. So you don't get good at something by never making a mistake. Mistakes are the secret sauce that actually turns you into something better than maybe you were before. Imposter syndrome really celebrates perfectionism. And I think because of that, it robs us of those learning opportunities. So what I think would be much more helpful to new grads is to stop labeling and instead really just start leaning into doubt and leaning into learning experience, and just explore what purpose that doubt might be there to serve. I just think that would be much more helpful.
So what are some common signs that new graduate therapists might experience with this?
I think one of the most common expressions of doubt that we see in new grads is really perfectionism, isn't it? They're feeling that they need to do everything flawlessly in order to be to avoid being seen as, potentially incompetent. And that can lead them to do a lot of overworking, a lot of over preparing for tasks, spending excessive amounts of time and energy on reports and treatment plans. Or they can even do completely the opposite and avoid tasks or new responsibilities or things, anything that they don't feel 100%, confident about. Another sign of doubt is that real fear of failure or rejection, and that can cause therapists to procrastinate, especially when, they're making decisions, or they're trying to, take some initiative, and they might frequently just seek reassurance from colleagues or their supervisors, and they lack confidence in their own judgment, and that can delay their progress. And they are, often just second guessing their choices and their recommendations, and they're really over relying on more experienced therapists to sort of externally validate their work. So a strong need to prove oneself is also really common with doubt. So new grads can often spend more hours in the office as a way of kind of demonstrating their worth. And I was definitely guilty of that when I first started. Definitely always the first one there, always the last one to leave. And that can cause us to feel really exhausted, and it can cause us to feel frustrated and burnt out, because despite all of that extra effort, those therapists still feel like they're not doing enough. And that overworking mindset can become a bit of a habit, and it can become, as I said, a way of almost like compensating for a perceived shortcoming. And the other hallmark of doubt, I think, is feeling isolated. So new grads often feel that they are the only ones struggling with those feelings, and they believe just everybody else has got it all sorted out. Their peers are just more confident and they're more competent, and that can actually prevent new grads from opening up about their experiences. It can prevent them from seeking support, and that just kind of really reinforces that cycle of self-doubt and inadequacy, I think, which just exacerbates the situation. And then I think finally, for therapists who are experiencing strong self-doubt, they do tend to downplay their successes, or not really notice as much when things go well. So instead of celebrating their achievements, they often say, oh, I just got lucky, or maybe it was timing, or it's because such and such helped me. They're all due to factors that are outside of their control. And that inability, I think, to really internalize their accomplishments just means when they do succeed, they don't see that as evidence of their abilities. And over time, that belief can really undermine their self-esteem, and it can impact their ability to really recognize, I think, their true potential as a therapist.
So how can new graduate therapists distinguish between healthy self-reflection and perfectionism?
Well, I think we know that healthy self-reflection is it's a really vital skill for any therapist, but especially for new grads. It just helps them to evaluate where they're at, to identify, areas for opportunity and for improvement. It can help them to set professional goals, but it's really critical, I think, to distinguish that between that really harsh over-analysis. And that's often driven, by self-doubt. And I think the way that you distinguish between those two styles really comes down to the outcome. So compassionate self-reflection leads to growth and it leads to progress. And the other just kind of leaves you feeling really stuck and unsure about what to do next. So I think for supervisors and for mentors and leaders who are managing new grads especially, I would suggest looking at how that clinician responds to self-reflection and also how they respond to feedback. So a therapist who's engaged in really healthy self-reflection, they're going to do something positive and proactive with it. They're going to feel empowered by it. There's a sense of agency and a desire to improve, whereas a therapist who's really highly self-critical is going to do the opposite. They will avoid certain tasks or situations or challenges, or they might demonstrate, increased anxiety or even a sense of helplessness. So I think it's really important just to kind of be aware of those things when we're managing and supporting our new grads. I'm a really big believer in supporting new grads to develop greater self-awareness, just by inviting them to really kindly explore their beliefs and their behavior patterns when it comes to reflection, because self-awareness is a superpower. So we can only change what we can see. And if we can see that our response isn't serving us in a way that's helpful, then, and probably only then, is when we can take steps to remedy that.
So what strategies do you suggest for overcoming imposter syndrome in the workplace?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's really important just to focus on our language and to start with that. So to be more mindful of how we're speaking to ourselves, how we're labeling ourselves, how we're labeling our experiences. So I'd actually encourage new grads to completely chuck out the term imposter syndrome and instead just really call a spade a spade. If you're feeling doubt, then call that out. Secondly, I think fostering self-compassion is so important. It's also completely underrated. So self-compassion is all about being really kind to ourselves. It's about showing empathy to ourselves. It's treating ourselves the same way that we treat a loved one. And what that does is it allows us to remove judgment and to simply acknowledge our emotions and to accept that they are part of our human experience. So thirdly, we have mindfulness. And mindfulness is like the cousin, I suppose, to self-compassion, and those two things work really well together. Mindfulness is all about observing. It's about noticing. It allows us to get back into the present moment. So we're not worried about what's coming. We're not dwelling on what's already been. We can really just detach, I suppose, from those unhelpful narratives and just come back to the body, come back to the nervous system so that we can connect with ourselves somatically. And I think one of the best ways we can practice mindfulness is through the breath. Our breath is always available to us. Our breath is actually what tells our brains that we're safe. And only when we feel safe can we actually regulate. And of course, when we're regulated, we can think more clearly and we can think logically. So we can respond to our challenges with greater confidence. Also, when we're back in our adult brain, when we engage with the neocortex, then we can use cognitive strategies and reframing techniques. And a really great example of this is just to simply ask ourselves, how can this doubt be useful to me? What's some small action I can take right now that's going to help me to reduce my doubt? Mentorship and connection are obviously really key components for supporting new grads in the workplace. So personally, I believe regular supervision and shadowing of more experienced therapists is really essential for new grads, not only in terms of helping them to develop their clinical skills, but also in creating that safe space for reflection that we were talking about, that healthy reflection. And I think finally, I would encourage therapists to get used to making mistakes and to make mistakes well. And we do that by viewing mistakes as learning opportunities. So there's a quote I love, which is, there is no failure, there is only feedback. So instead of just viewing errors as evidence of us being inadequate, we can see them for what they actually are. And that is, they are essential steps in us being able to learn and for us being able to grow. Mistakes are the currency of excellence. And I think by normalizing that process of learning through experience, then therapists are going to feel more confident in their abilities. And they're also going to feel less threatened by the inevitable challenges of our profession.
So how can peer support help new graduates overcome this syndrome?
Well, mentorship obviously plays a really crucial role in helping new grads to work through doubt by providing obviously, practical guidance and emotional support. And one of the benefits, I think, of mentoring or coaching is that it gives new grads access to more seasoned professionals who can help to validate their experience and just normalise their feelings. So I have seen firsthand how powerful it is when a mentor shares their own struggles. It really helps to sort of disarm the doubt, and it reassures the new grad that those feelings, they're common. They're not a sign of personal behaviour. Our brains are like these meaning-making machines. So for every experience that we encounter, humans automatically ask themselves, so what does this say about me? And that can result in like a sense of suffering. But with coaching or mentoring, new grads can be supported to really increase their awareness of that thinking pattern. So they start to notice when that's happening. And because they can see it, they can, of course, then challenge that narrative. Another really important aspect of mentoring, I think, is providing that, as we said, that safe space for new therapists so they can discuss their doubts and their fears without judgment. So I know many new grads who really struggle with quite excessive self-doubt are reluctant to admit that to their colleagues or to their supervisors. They think they're just going to be seen as being inadequate. So a good mentor is going to offer an environment where the mentee can be really vulnerable, where they can ask questions, where they can express uncertainty. And that open communication is really vital for removing the isolation that accompanies doubt. So we know that humans are wired for connection. It is how we feel safe. And mentoring gets to be a way of offering that. And lastly, I think good mentors also provide networking opportunities. So they introduce new grads to wider professional community. So by connecting with other professionals, hearing about their experiences, new grads can really expand their support system and feel less alone.
So, can it affect a therapeutic relationship between the counsellor and the client? So, how can new therapists overcome this?
I think excessive doubt can definitely impact the therapeutic relationship because it just undermines the therapist's confidence. And that can, potentially lead to things like overcompensation, overworking, all the things we've talked about, procrastination, perfectionism, inconsistency of recommendations. So I think managing that just involves, firstly, as I've said, just really acknowledging self-doubt and kindly exploring the purpose of the doubt, seeking connection and supervision, and just really recognizing that mistakes and uncertainty, they're just part of the learning process. We don't get to skip that bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes absolute sense. So are there workshops and resources available through your business, the Mindful OT, that is focused on imposter syndrome for new graduates and how they can overcome this?
Yeah, well, I offer private coaching. So I work with OT students, new grads, experienced OTs who are really struggling with doubt, showing up dysfunctionally in their lives personally and professionally. So I do that. I also offer a fully self-paced online course called Thrive, and that really digs deep into all things emotional regulation, into thinking traps like, doubt, and stress management. So I always feel like that course gives you the skills that we weren't taught at uni. So the ones that actually help you to manage yourself within our very unique profession. So specifically, I built that course for OTs who were experiencing doubt, who were feeling like they weren't good enough, who wanted really sustainable and fulfilling careers, who were wanting to proactively prevent or protect themselves, I suppose, from burnout, and to learn more practical ways to support their health and well-being and self-care. So that particular course is, designed by an OT for OTs. It's delivered under an OT framework. And if people are wanting more information on that or any of my services, you can obviously go to my website, themindfulot.au. So little shameless plug there, Michael.
Okay. So how can you graduate therapists set realistic goals to counteract those feelings associated with imposter syndrome?
Yeah. I think we often kind of go to the goal, like we're like, what can we do about this? But what I would encourage new grads to do first is, before we can get into that cognitive space, that is required for goal setting, we first get to connect with the body. So connect in with the nervous system to simply accept and acknowledge that doubt is a natural part of our being. And just lean into that emotion. So once we are then connected with our nervous system, we are feeling safe. We're out of that protection system into that connection system and feeling more regulated. I think then we can go about sort of kindly just exploring the situation that we're in. So as I've mentioned, doubt has a function, and turning towards that rather than away from it just allows us to better meet ourselves where we're at. And then when we know where we're at, that I think is when we can start setting some goals that are aligned to those needs.
Okay, so what advice do you have for new graduate therapists who struggle with the self-doubt during their client sessions?
I think in that moment, when you are experiencing self-doubt, the panic is setting in when you're actually in a session, I would suggest a circuit breaker. So anything that is going to allow you to take a little break. That might be, I need to use the bathroom, or maybe you could invite the client to go and make a cup of tea. Maybe you need to, feign the need to make a phone call. Anything that is just going to allow you to have a little bit of space. And then with that, what I would definitely do is absolutely encourage the therapist just to take some slow, deep breaths. It sounds so simple, but as I said, this is how we communicate to our brain. We regulate using that bottom-up approach, that body to brain, and then we can reestablish safety within the nervous system. Once you're back in that sort of space where you're just feeling a bit more regulated, you could then go back into the session and you might consider moving to another task or activity that maybe you felt a little bit more confident or comfortable with. That is obviously quite a reactive approach for what is happening in the moment. So to prevent that from happening in the first place, you could just make sure that you're preparing for your sessions. So really maybe having a talk to a supervisor and discussing all of the things that could potentially pop up and how you might manage them. But I think, at the end of the day, just remember, if all else fails, we are human. And not every session is going to go perfectly. Not every session is going to go to plan. That I've been an OT for over 20 years, and that is absolutely going to happen at different times. But at the end of the day, I think if we can just remind ourselves that our clients are the expert in their own experience. So as long as we're connecting with them, as long as we're doing our best to support their needs, then that's the win.
Okay, so how can ongoing professional development and learning serve as a remedy, and how do you do this?
Continuous learning, obviously, therapists with things like knowledge, it provides skills. They need those things in order to feel more competent. And I spoke earlier about how doubt's a really great indicator as to level of personal resourcing. So continuous learning is a really good way of adding to our resourcing. It's a way of adding tools to our tool belt. I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say that professional development was a remedy, however, because there's always more to learn. We can never know everything about everything. And I think if we approach PD as a way of curing our doubt, then it would be like trying to chase the end of a rainbow. So we also understand that looking at the research on things like imposter thoughts and feelings, that we can experience that really pervasive doubt despite loads of experience. So despite having all the knowledge and all the professional development, we can still experience that, level of doubt. So what I would encourage instead is just to really lean into the doubt rather than going in with the approach of trying to fix it. I think engaging in ongoing development as a way of filling your personal and professional cup is just more helpful. We can see it as an opportunity to gather skills, to connect with others, to lean into experiences that we're going to enjoy, to build mastery and confidence. And it also helps us then to develop that growth mindset. And that is what is going to allow us to sort of see new challenges as learning opportunities.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And one more question, and we ask this to all our deep dive guests here on the Deep Dive podcast. Now, if you have one piece of advice in 30 seconds or less, what would that be?
My advice is always to lean towards things that you're feeling some resistance to, because what we resist will persist. So these things are kind of coming up for a reason. So if we can compassionately embrace that, and as I said, kind of just connect in with that, we're going to cause a lot less struggle for ourselves, a lot less unnecessary struggle, I suppose. So that would be my thing. Whatever is popping up for you that you're thinking, this is not very nice, lean into that because there's something there for you. There's a reason it's coming up.
Okay. And on that note, Leesa Tuffnell, thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Check out Leesa's website at themindfulot.au or at Instagram and Facebook at themindfulotau.